Hello, everybody. Okay. All you great friends and lovers of nonviolence and peace, welcome and thanks for being here. You're in for a really wonderful evening and a talk, and I think eventually at some point there'll be a lot of dialogue and interaction with our guest tonight. I want to first just thank everyone who's been supporting our event. This event is part of an annual celebration of the Worldwide International Day of Peace. And we've been taking part in this for the last 4 years. And there are a number of activities and events that we usually plan during this week. Tomorrow is the International Day of Nonviolence. It's part of a movement this year called Global Truce 2012. So our activities and our efforts and our work and our acknowledgement of promoting the ideals of peace and nonviolence throughout the world really become part of a global effort, particularly tomorrow, with people around the world who also are friends and lovers of peace and nonviolence. So in that respect, we join a worldwide community. We want to thank, of course, all of the people who help and work and volunteer with the Center for Nonviolence to make these kinds of programs possible, the continued support from the President's Office and the Provost's Office supporting the important mission and work of the Center for Nonviolence at the University of Rhode Island. The center was established in 1998 under the leadership of Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr., who brought with him the legacy of nonviolence directly from his work in the 60s with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Our work is very specialized and unique in this regard, in that we have a special training and leadership program here at the university, one of the few places really in the world where we offer this kind of training at the university level. Over the last 12 to 14 years, we have a series of international nonviolence summer institutes. We've trained literally hundreds and thousands of people around the world through a training of trainers model in probably nearly 40 countries now. We have certified trainers doing these kinds of nonviolence and peace training programs. So we're grateful to the university for continuing their support of the center, and we want to invite all of you, whether you're a university student or a member of the public, to participate with us in the center. There's work for everyone to do promoting peace and nonviolence. So to get on with our speaker tonight, it's a great pleasure to have Paul Chappell here with us. My introduction will just be very brief, but I'll say this, that one of the key principles of nonviolence is that we believe it's a way of life for courageous people. And to do the work of nonviolence day in and day out, as Paul has been doing, really is a testament to his courage. So I'm really happy to introduce him to you tonight. He is a West Point graduate, an Iraq war veteran, a former U.S. Army captain. He has been on his own journey of peace and nonviolence, finding his own personal truth with it, which he has shared very openly in 3 of the books, which are available to you to read more about in the back of the room. That's Will War End? The End of War, Peaceful Revolution, and I believe there's a 4th book on the way called Waging Peace.
The Art of Waging Peace.
The Art of Waging Peace. So look forward to that. So without taking up any more time, please welcome Paul Chappell.
Thank you for being here. Can all of you hear me in the back? Can all of you hear me? If you can't hear me, please raise your hand. So I'd like to begin by asking all of you a question. And the question I want to ask you is, what do you think when you hear the words world peace? When somebody says world peace, what do you think? When somebody says, I want world peace, what comes to mind? Impossible. Great answer, impossible. What else comes to mind? Utopia. Right? Miss America, that's it. That's what I grew up thinking when I heard world peace. I thought about beauty pageant contestants and, I want world peace. It's naive. And I think that's what most Americans think. Have any of you seen the movie Miss Congeniality with Sandra Bullock? Well, there's a scene in the film where there's a beauty pageant. An interviewer asks the beauty pageant contestants what they want, and they all say world peace. And it's supposed to be a joke, right? Because world peace is supposed to be a joke. So there's a problem there. If we think that world peace is a joke and naive, how can we transition and move in that direction if people think of it as a joke? So I can tell you what I thought about world peace when I was growing up, because I didn't grow up in the peace movement. So for a long time, I thought that world peace was a naive dream. My father served in the Army for 30 years, and he fought in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. My mother lived in Japan during World War II, and she lived in Korea during the Korean War. I graduated from West Point. I served in the Army for 7 years. I was deployed to Baghdad, and I left the Army just 3 years ago as a captain. But what if I told you that I learned at West Point and in the Army that world peace is possible? Furthermore, a simple question can help us understand whether world peace is possible or whether world peace is a naive dream. And that question is, are human beings naturally violent or naturally peaceful? If we're naturally violent and it's just a part of our nature to kill each other, it's really naive to think world peace is ever going to happen. But if we're not naturally violent and people have to be trained and conditioned to become violent, then maybe world peace has a chance. So please raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent. Nobody thinks that? Wow, you're a really optimistic group. Please raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally peaceful. Okay. Please raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent and naturally peaceful. Okay. Most hands go up on that one. So we'll talk about this. So I speak to a lot of groups, and normally when I say that we're not naturally violent, to most people that makes no sense. It contradicts everything they hear in the news, everything they learn growing up, everything they hear in the media. The idea that we're not naturally violent to most people makes no sense. And I'll give you a couple other examples of ideas that make no sense. Okay, here's another idea that when people first heard it made no sense. The idea that the earth goes around the sun. If you were to go back 2,000 years and try to convince people that the earth goes around the sun, would that be an easy or hard thing to do? It'd be nearly impossible. Because if the earth goes around the sun, why don't you feel a sense of motion? Why don't you feel movement? I mean, the earth is going really, really quickly around the sun. You don't feel anything moving. And if the earth is spinning, why don't you feel it spin? If you go around a merry-go-round, and the merry-go-round is going really, really fast, what happens if you let go? You go flying off the merry-go-round. So why don't people go flying off the earth? The earth is spinning around 1,000 miles an hour, and people don't just go flying off the earth. We're going very, very fast around the sun. We don't feel any motion. And even today, we say the sun rises, the sun sets. If you look up at the sky, it looks like everything's going around you. So you don't feel any motion, you don't feel anything spinning. You look up, everything's going around you. Right? It's obvious everything's moving around me. I don't know what you're talking about. It makes no sense at first glance. Here's another idea that at first glance makes no sense. The other idea is the earth is round. If you were to go back 2,000 years ago and try to convince people that the earth was round, would that be an easy or hard thing to do? It'd be nearly impossible. Because if the earth is round, why don't the people on the bottom of the earth fall off the earth? Why don't the people on the sides slide off the earth? If the earth is round, the only people standing up straight are at the top. The people here, they're tilted. And then the people on the bottom are upside down, but they don't feel like they're upside down. But it makes no sense. Why don't people fall off the bottom? If you have a ball, anything on the bottom is going to fall off. So it really makes no sense at first glance. And the idea that we're not naturally violent at first glance makes no sense, because people go, well, why is there war? Why is there murder? Why is there genocide? How can we be not naturally violent if there's war? So we're going to talk about all of this. And we're going to clear up the misconceptions. And I want to begin by asking you another question. What is the greatest problem of every army in world history? Every army in world history, no matter what time period or culture, has a single greatest problem. Can any of you guess what that problem is? Every army's greatest problem. Every time period, every culture, universally true. And if you heard me say this before, please don't give it away. Let people figure it out. Pardon?
Lack of enemy.
Lack of enemy? Think about the perspective of a general. You're a general. And think about what you have to worry about. You have to worry about food. You have to worry about supplies, equipment. You have to worry about the enemy army killing you. You have to think, how am I going to defeat this other army? You got to think about logistics, strategy. But there's a problem that's bigger than all of those problems. If you don't solve this problem, the battle can't even begin.
Motivation.
Motivation. Oh, great. What kind of motivation? To kill. Great. Great answer. And that is a big problem. Getting soldiers to kill. You have to train soldiers how to kill. But there's an even bigger problem than that. The greatest problem of every army in world history isn't getting soldiers to kill, although that is a very big problem. The greatest problem of every army in world history is getting soldiers to die. The greatest problem of every army in world history is when a battle begins, how do you stop soldiers from running away? If you look at combat, in combat, our flight response is far more powerful than our fight response. Most people's natural reaction, when you try to stab them with a sword or shoot them with a rifle, most people's natural reaction is to run away as fast as they can, as far as they can. Ask anyone who's been in combat and they'll tell you it's terrifying. And General Patton said anyone who says they're not afraid in combat is a liar. So forget everything you've seen in Hollywood. Forget everything you've seen in television, Hollywood movies, and just think about common sense. If a grown man ran at you screaming, waving a machete, I'd probably freak you out, right? You'd probably think, let me go the other direction. Now, what if there's 10,000 grown men with swords screaming, running at you? That's truly terrifying. And maybe you have an army on your side, but what if the other army outnumbers you 5-1? What if you have 2,000, they have 10,000, and they're running at you trying to kill you? Our instinct is to run, not get hurt, not get killed. So if you look at all the ancient battles, the purpose of the ancient battle, if you look at Hollywood, they show them as a melee, but the way the ancient battles worked, the purpose of the battle was to get the enemy to retreat. That's where the majority of the casualties happen. So the way an ancient battle would work is they would fight in very tightly compact formations. And the only people fighting and dying are the people at the very front. So the battle might go on for hours and hours and hours, and each side might lose 3 or 4% of their army. But what happens is one army will panic, retreat, and then as they're retreating, you kill them. So if you look at the ancient battles, you have very lopsided numbers of casualties. Where the army retreats would lose over 90% of its army. The army that wins loses very few soldiers. So when the army retreats, you run them down with your cavalry and you massacre them as they run away. So the purpose of the army, of the battle, was to get the other side to panic, retreat, and then you kill them as they're retreating. And a friend one time asked me, well, how did they make them retreat? How did they make them panic? A friend asked me one time, she said, how did they make armies in the ancient world panic? How did they make soldiers in the ancient world panic? And I said, they made people panic by trying to kill them. When you try to kill people, when you try to stab a big piece of metal into their abdomen, it tends to freak people out, right? When you have a big sharp piece of metal and you try to stick it into their abdomen, it tends to freak people out. And the armies have a ripple effect. If one part of the army panicked, it would spread. One part of the line would break and the whole army would fall apart. So you make people panic by trying to kill them. And that tends to freak people out. So raise your hand if you like getting a cavity. Anybody like getting a cavity? Now think about how bad it is to get a cavity today, right? It's terrible. Going to the dentist, getting your tooth drilled. Now imagine getting a cavity in 500 BC. No painkiller, no antibiotics, no dentist. They're just going to yank your tooth out with a bunch of whatever kind of pliers they had back then. So think about how bad it would be to get your hand cut off today. Now think about getting your hand cut off in 500 BC. Think about getting stabbed in the abdomen today. If you get stabbed in the abdomen, call 911, go to the emergency room, get surgery. You're going to be in the hospital for a week or so. But imagine getting stabbed in the abdomen in 500 BC with a spear. You're going to die a painful, slow death. Right? No emergency rooms, no surgeons, no painkiller, no antibiotics. Extremely dangerous. thing to be involved in. But the ancient world did have a lot of wars, right? People fought and they killed and they died. So how did ancient armies learn to how did they make their soldiers fight and not retreat? What did ancient armies do? There's many techniques they can use to make soldiers fight and not retreat. But what is the most effective method they used to get soldiers to fight and not retreat? What did they do? Because there were a lot of wars back then. Brainwashing? Great point. There's many techniques that can be used, but there's a single most effective technique. Oh, great answer. Defending. Great. We're going to talk about that. That's a great answer. Any other thoughts? A great answer. Yes, ma'am? Oh, that's an interesting thing. Killing deserters. That's a great, interesting thing. Now, armies will do that as a last resort. But keep in mind, you want your army to be killing the other side. You don't want your army to be killing itself. That's a very inefficient, right? Every time you kill your own soldier, you have one less soldier to use to kill the enemy. So you have to willingly get people to fight and to kill and to die. So here's a way to make this very simple. What would all of you die for? Raise your hand if you would risk your life to protect your family. Raise your hand if you'd risk your life to protect your family. See, that's what they did. I think Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher, said it best when he said, "By being loving, we are capable of being brave." The Greeks realized that if soldiers believe they are fighting to protect their friends, their family, and their loved ones, they will not only fight, but they will even sacrifice their lives, because our instinct to protect our loved ones is far more powerful than our instinct for self-preservation. Think about how you would react if you saw your loved ones being attacked. Think about how you would rush to their aid and try to protect them. So I heard a story a few years ago that illustrates this. I heard a story a few years ago about an 80-year-old woman. And this 80-year-old woman was walking down the street, and she was walking down the street, and there was a loose pit bull running toward her. So what would you do if you were walking down the street, and there was a loose pit bull running toward you? Would your instinct be to go run at the pit bull and fight it, or to run away or climb a tree, go in the house, get to safety? What would your instinct be? Or this madness fighting a pit bull. Like the human brain, that's not our first reaction when we see an animal running at us aggressively. We think, get away, get to safety. But this story was about an 80-year-old woman, and she was walking her little poodle, and the pit bull ran up and clamped its jaws on her poodle, and the 80-year-old woman bent down and bit the pit bull on the neck until the pit bull let go. So she actually bit the pit bull. So the dynamic, look at how the dynamic changes. If it's you and a pit bull, or you and a wild animal, or you and an attacker, your instinct is to flee. But imagine a pit bull or wild animal or a person attacking your child, or your grandchild, or your parent, or your sibling, or your loved one. You're going to rush over there and try to help your loved one. And this is why the Army has this band of brothers thing going on. You ever wonder why the Army has this whole thing about band of brothers and camaraderie and the love between soldiers? It's not out of any kind of sentimental feeling. It's out of military necessity. Because you need to turn the Army into this family unit. You turn it into this band of brothers, this strong family unit, and then you put this family unit in a situation where people are trying to kill their comrades, and people fight to protect their comrades. They fight and die to protect their loved ones on the battlefield. Have any of you seen the movie Forrest Gump? Why did Forrest Gump risk his life to save Bubba in the Vietnam scene? They were best friends, right? So armies take people from different backgrounds, turn them into a family, and puts them in a situation where people are trying to kill their family. So at West Point, I learned a very famous passage from Shakespeare's Henry V, which reads, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." So love of comrades is one psychological technique that the Greeks used to make soldiers fight and not retreat. Another psychological technique that the Greeks used was love of country. Love of country. Have any of you heard of the Battle of Thermopylae? Very famous battle in the Persian War, Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies defended the pass against the Persians. Any of you heard that battle? Okay. Any of you seen the movie 300? Okay, it's the same battle, but 300 is very unrealistic. So during the Persian War, the decisive battle was not the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartans were defending and passing against the Persians. The decisive battle was the Battle of Salamis, where the Athenian general Themistocles had to defeat a very large Persian navy with a very small Greek navy. So imagine how frightening it is to have one person trying to kill you. Now imagine being outnumbered 3-1, 4-1, 5-1. So the Athenians were greatly outnumbered. If you look at the Battle of Marathon, if you look at Thermopylae, if you look at the Battle of Salamis, they're greatly outnumbered by the opposing army. And to inspire the courage that made their victory possible, the Athenians shouted the following battle cry: "Advance, you sons of Greece! From oppression save your wives, save your children, save your country. This day the common cause of all demands your valor." Most people will die to protect their loved ones. I think many of you would die to protect your loved ones. So when the Athenians heard that, "Advance, ye sons of Greece, from oppression save your wives, save your children, save your country, this day the common cause of all demands your valor," they were ready to fight to the death. And I think that battle cry has been used by every government since then. Not word for word, but the essence of that battle cry. Because whenever a government wants to make its population go to war, they have to say that we're fighting to protect our freedom, or we're fighting to protect our family, or our way of life, or all these noble things we have to protect if you look at how war is framed for people, right? So here's a question. How many wars have there been in human history? How many wars have there been in human history? Maybe thousands? Maybe too many to count. But do you know, in all of world history, all of military history, there has never been a single war, not one war, where a national leader told his people they're fighting for money or gold or oil. Every war is about self-defense, liberating people. When Mao invaded Tibet, he said he was trying to liberate Tibet from the dictator known as the Dalai Lama. The Romans were liberating the barbarians from darkness, giving them civilization and law and order. Or it's about fighting for ideals, freedom, democracy, protecting our way of life, honor. Always noble rhetoric. Any culture, without exception. You look at the Nazis. Nazi Germany published a book of all of Hitler's speeches from 1933. And the title of the book is "The New Germany Wants Work and Peace." And they're all peace speeches about how Hitler wants to spread human rights throughout Europe, and how he wants to help better the German people and all people, and how we're under attack by enemies and we have to defend ourselves. The Mongols, the Romans, the Athenians, the Spartans, they had this idea of self-defense, protecting our loved ones, and it's propaganda. It's really good propaganda. So imagine you're a Roman farmer. Imagine you're a poor Roman farmer. And the Roman emperor says to you, "Look, I want you to go to war, and the worst case scenario for you is you die, and your wife becomes a widow, and your children become orphans, and the best case scenario for you is you come back to your farm." He's going to say, "Are you crazy? Why am I going to go do that?" But what if the Roman emperor says, "Look, if you don't go to war, these evil people are going to come kill your family, and take away your farm, and take away your freedom, and ruin your life." Then he's going to fight ferociously. So think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would the greatest problem of every army in world history be when a battle begins, how do you stop soldiers from running away? And why would governments have to manipulate our love in order to make us go to war? So another question. What does war do to the human mind? What does prolonged exposure to war do to the human brain? Desensitizes. What else does war do to the human mind? Disorders, right? What kind of disorders? PTSD, exactly. War is traumatizing. War traumatizes the human brain. People go to war and they come back insane sometimes. And a lot of people have serious mental trauma. But if we were naturally violent, why would war traumatize the human brain? If we were naturally violent, why would so many people go to war and have mental trauma from war? Prolonged, intense combat. If you look at World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, there were more American soldiers pulled off the front lines from nervous breakdowns than were killed in the wars. So if you look at World War II, there were a little over 400,000 American soldiers killed in the war, and there were 504,000 American soldiers pulled off the front lines from having nervous breakdowns. And keep in mind, one of the primary purposes of basic training is to weed out the people who are most likely to suffer nervous breakdowns in war. That's why in basic training you're being screamed at all the time, because they're trying to weed out the people who are most likely to have a nervous breakdown. But yet, there were 504,000 soldiers pulled off the front lines from nervous breakdowns. If you look at the Korean War, it was at a rate of 250 per thousand per year being pulled off the front lines from nervous breakdowns. And that's why the armies now have to do combat rotations and give people days off and give them rotations so your brain can come back and recover. But if we were naturally violent, wouldn't you go to war and become more mentally healthy? And the longer you're in war, the more mentally healthy you become? Wouldn't that be the case if we were naturally violent? Why would war put so much stress in the human mind? So the Army did a study. There were two Army medical doctors, Swank and Marchand. And they did a study that found that one of them was at D-Day. It was a study done during World War II. And they found that after 60 days of sustained day-night combat, 98% of soldiers suffer psychiatric trauma. After 60 days of sustained day-night combat, 98% of soldiers suffer psychiatric trauma. Keep in mind that 60 days of sustained day-night combat is a 20th century phenomenon because prior to World War I, soldiers typically took the nights off. Prior to World War I, soldiers typically wouldn't fight at night. And how long was the Battle of Gettysburg? 3 days, right? 3 days. But in World War I, World War II, you had situations where soldiers were trapped in combat. Constant artillery bombardment, non-stop for days on end. And what happened to the human mind? So they found that after 60 days of sustained day-night combat, 98% of soldiers suffer psychiatric trauma. But 2% of soldiers can be exposed to war for long periods of time and kill and kill and kill and never go insane. So why is that 2% different? Why can 2% of soldiers be exposed to war for long periods of time and never go insane? And why can the other 98% not do that? The reason why 2% of soldiers are never driven insane by war, according to the study, is because they were already insane before they went to war. Right? They were aggressive psychopaths. And fortunately for us, they're the 2%, not the 98%.
Upsetting to me, and I'm thinking actually that I'm going to leave because I'm such a peace lover, and this discussion of fighting is
okay.
I respect your service. I respect the history that you're teaching, but for me,
well, if I could just say something. So, if you look at a doctor, the job of a doctor is to promote health, right? Health. What do doctors spend all of their time studying? Illness, disease, sickness. If our job is to promote peace, we have to understand violence. We have to understand the nature of violence, the causes of violence. We have to look at violence like a disease, like an illness. And if we're going to make the world less violent, we have to understand how does this illness operate? How does this illness spread? What causes people to be infected with violence? What kind of conditions make people violent? And I think that if we're really going to address these issues of violence, we have to look at violence like an illness, like a disease. So I'm talking about violence from the perspective of we have to solve these problems. But when we understand how people are conditioned to be violent, we can understand how can we uncondition them to be violent. If these circumstances make people violent, if the war propaganda says we have to protect our family and our freedom, and you hear an American president say we have to protect our freedom and our family, you got to think, wait a minute, I've heard this before. This is an old story. Self-defense, liberating people, the same old story from the Roman Empire. So I appreciate your concern, and I try not to get too graphic, but I think we have to get rid of the propaganda, the mythology, and we gotta expose all the lies, and so yeah, and it's uplifting when you hear we're not naturally violent. It's like, oh my goodness, wow, maybe we're not that bad. Maybe this peace thing can actually happen. Maybe there's hope, you know. So yeah. So again, the trauma. If we were naturally violent, why would the trauma happen? So here's another question. During World War II, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy fired their weapons at the enemy? During World War II, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy fired their weapons at the enemy? Close. About 30%. Any other guesses? It's about 15%. Now, during the Vietnam War, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy fired their weapons at the enemy? Was it higher, the same, lower? What do you think? You'd think it'd be lower, right? Because during World War II, we were fighting the Nazis, and Japan attacked us on our own soil. What did the Vietnamese ever do to us? Prior to the Vietnam War, most Americans never heard of Vietnam. And the Japanese didn't look like us, but the Vietnamese didn't either. But it was higher. How much higher do you think it was? 40%? 70? It was about 90%. In World War II, about 15% of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy fired their weapons at the enemy. During the Korean War, it was about 90%. The Vietnam War, it was around, or Korean War is about 55%. Vietnam War is about 90%. Today, it's nearly 100%. So what happened? How did it go from 15% to 90% in 30 years? What changed? Professional Army. Great. What else? Conditioning, right? What happened was the Army got better at training people how to kill. The Army got better at training people how to kill. The key term is training people how to kill. Killing isn't as easy as most people think. Armies have to put a lot of effort into training people how to kill, because that's not a natural instinct that we have to kill our own species. And this problem goes back way before World War II. During the Civil War, soldiers spent 95% of their time loading their rifles and 5% of their time aiming and firing their rifles. So you would think that if thousands of rifles had been recovered from soldiers killed in combat during the Civil War, that most of them would not be loaded. But after the Battle of Gettysburg, they recovered about 27,000 rifles. 24,000 of the rifles, 90%, were loaded. 12,000 of the rifles had more than one bullet loaded in the barrel. 6,000 of the rifles had 3 to 10 bullets loaded in the barrel. And one of the rifles had 23 bullets loaded in the barrel. So do you see what was happening? Soldiers were loading their rifles over and over again, so it would look like they're doing something, but they weren't firing. So we got to understand, how is the brain programming? How is the brain programmed for this? Then we can understand how we can prevent it and how we can undo it, right? Again, viewing violence like a disease or like an illness in terms of conditioning, and especially if you look at violent crime. I mean, the big thing is violent crime. Understanding how people are conditioned to be violent in a criminal way. So what is it about military training that makes people such effective killers? What is it about military training that makes people such effective killers? What is it about it? Oh, we'll talk about that next. Great point. We'll talk about that whole next subject. That's a great point. Something called reflex training. Reflex training. Conditioning. So here's how reflex training works. If I go out into the street and I try to punch some random person in the face, how are 99% of people going to react? People, no martial arts training, no boxing training, how are 99% of people going to react? They're going to flinch, right? Close their eyes, protect their face. That's your natural reaction, and it's a very smart reaction, because your eyes are very vulnerable, your face is very vulnerable. Flinch, protect your face. Okay? Now, what if every day for an hour a day I hit a punching bag? Every day for an hour a day I hit a punching bag. I do that for a year. Every day for an hour a day, hit a punching bag, do that for a year. Now what will I do if someone tries to hit me? I'm going to flinch. Because a punching bag never tries to hit me back, right? Or the punching bag never tries to hit me. I can hit a lot harder, but I still have the old reaction. But now, what if every day for an hour a day I have a martial arts training partner, and he simulates punching me and I evade and I counterattack. He simulates punching me, I evade and I counterattack. He simulates punching me, I evade and I counterattack. And then we put gloves on and pads and we do realistic sparring, right? Now what do I do if someone tries to hit me? Now I'm going to react, because I've reprogrammed my brain through repetition. Over and over again, I've reprogrammed my brain to react differently. My brain can almost react without thinking. It's almost like a new reflex. So here's a story about how powerful the reflex training is. Here's a story about how powerful the reflex training is. There's a story in this book, On Combat, written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He talks about these two police officers, and they were training how to disarm a gunman. So the one police officer, his partner would pull out a gun, He'd disarm it, give it back to him. His partner pull out the gun again, disarm it, give it back to him. His partner pull out the gun again, disarm it, give it back to him, over and over again, hundreds of times. So one day they went into a convenience store. They went around the corner, there was a robber. Went around the corner, the robber pulled out a gun, and without thinking, the police officer disarmed the gun and gave it back to him. So the reflex training is so powerful that you can train people to do things that will get them killed. That's why the Army has a motto, train like you fight, because when your brain is flooded with fear and adrenaline, your brain can't think. So whatever you program into the brain during training, during conditioning, goes out the other end in combat. So if you look at World War II, during World War II, soldiers would fire at round paper bullseye targets, but there's never been a country attacked by round paper bullseye targets, right? So Vietnam War, soldiers would fire at a target shaped like a human being, goes down. Target shaped like a human being pops up, shoot it, goes down. Target shaped like a human being pops up, goes down, over and over again, where it becomes a new reflex. Okay. Now, any of you read a book called On Killing, written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman? A book called On Killing. Raise your hand if you've read it. So Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman was a West Point psychology professor, an Army Ranger, and he wrote a book called On Killing. It's required reading in some classes at West Point, it's required reading at the FBI Academy. It's on the Marine Corps Commandant's required reading list. It's also required reading in peace studies programs at Berkeley and in Quaker and Mennonite colleges. So his premise in this book, On Killing, is On Killing, and the subtitle is The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society. The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society. So his premise is that it is unnatural for human beings to kill other human beings, and we have to be trained to kill people effectively, and we actually have this natural resistance to killing other human beings. And he says other animal species also have a natural aversion to killing their own species. He said if you look at rattlesnake will bite every other animal with its lethal fangs, but when rattlesnakes fight each other, what do? They wrestle. They don't fight each other. They don't bite each other the way they bite other animals. They wrestle. If you look at King Cobra bite other animals and they eat other snakes. They actually eat other snakes. But when they fight each other, they wrestle. If you look at an African buffalo or a deer or any animal with horns, if an African buffalo fights a lion, it tries to hit the lion in the ribs, in the flank, to kill it, or in the abdomen. But when African buffalo fight each other, how do they fight? They fight head to head, which is the least lethal form of combat, right? If you look at leopards, hyenas, bears, a lot of predators, when they fight other animal species, they go for strangulation and abdominal bites. When they fight their own species, they tend not to go for strangulation and abdominal bites. If you want to kill an animal and you're a predator, you want to bite the abdomen or the neck. But if you look at a dog, when a dog shows submission, the dog rolls over and shows its belly. And the other dog knows not to attack it. Now think about that. Why does an African buffalo fight a lion by hitting it in the ribs to try to kill it? And why, when African buffalo fight each other, why do they fight head to head, the least lethal form of combat? And why is that? Why do they fight like that? Preservation of the species. Preservation of the species, right? If African buffalo fought each other the way they fought lion, they'd go extinct. African buffalo spend 99% of their time around what animal? African buffalo. If they fought each other the way they fought other animals, they all go extinct. Even if you won the fight, you might have so many injuries in your ribs and you might die from infection. Remember, there's no emergency rooms in the wild. So if you get injured, you're probably going to die, if it's a serious injury. Now, human beings also have this natural aversion. It makes sense that we might, because we spend most of our time around other humans, right? It makes sense we might have a natural aversion. But what evidence do we have? The evidence we have is all military history. All the military history proves this. So in On Killing, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman says that in order to wage war, a country must portray the enemy in a certain way. How must the country portray the enemy in order to wage war against them? What must the country do? Non-human. You must dehumanize the enemy. And again, we have thousands of wars in history, and every single war requires dehumanization. There's never been one war in history where both sides saw each other as human. And this is done through what Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman calls distance. And he talks about 3 kinds of distance. The first form of distance is psychological distance. Psychological distance means portraying people as subhuman. And this is often done through derogatory name-calling. And in On Killing, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman talks about how our own country has used derogatory name-calling in war to betray people as subhuman. So what do we call the Germans when we fought them? Krauts, right? What do we call the Japanese when we fought them? Japs, right? What do we call the Vietnamese when we fought them? Goofs, right? And keep in mind there's multiple racial slurs for every ethnic group. There's multiple racial slurs for every ethnic group. I'm half Korean, a quarter white, and a quarter black, and I grew up in Alabama, so I've heard a lot of them. And what do we call people who are fighting now in the Middle East? What do you always hear in the media? Ragheads, but what do you hear in the media, though? There's a word you always hear, terrorist, right? Terrorist. When you hear the word terrorist, do you immediately think of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Christian? Is that what pops into your head? Do you think of a white Christian? Do you think of Timothy McVeigh? Do you think of the guy in Norway who killed all those people? When the guy in Norway killed all those people, they called him a gunman. Right? But if a Muslim is in his own country fighting the U.S., he's a terrorist. A Muslim's in his own country fighting us, he's a terrorist. And it does have a racial connotation. Right? So it's important to think about this. Again, studying violence, dehumanization like a disease, like an illness, you can make predictions. You can relate to and understand the world. So if you know this about human behavior and you study violence, and you hear a word like illegal alien, you can think, that's a weird word to use. It sounds like a convict from Mars or something, illegal alien. Or illegal, right? So you can be very perceptive now, and you can prevent the propaganda from fooling you. I heard a talk by Akila Shrills. Akila Shrills gave... He's a peace activist. He was a gang member, and he helped negotiate a peace treaty between the Bloods and the Crips. And he said the word gang member is a dehumanization word. Because if the local media says 2 14-year-old boys were shot today, people get really upset. But if the media goes 2 gang members were killed, people go, oh, they probably deserved it. They're probably asking for it, right? So you can look at all these different things. I mean, this goes way back through history. What did the ancient Greeks call all non-Greeks? What did the ancient Greeks call all non-Greeks? Barbarian, exactly. Any of you know where the word barbarian came from? It was a way of making fun of how people talked originally. It was a way of making fun of how people talked. In ancient Greece, if you didn't speak Greek and you talked, it sounded like you were saying bar, 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 and they called you barbarian. The way you talk. You know how in our culture we make fun of how Chinese people talk? Or we make fun of how Middle Eastern people talk? And it's the same phenomenon, making fun of how people talk. Oh, they're making a bunch of animal noises. They're not civilized people. And my whole father's family, going back to slavery, is black. And the most infamous dehumanization word in history, my father grew up under segregation. My ancestors are all black on that side. And I wondered, how did that happen? And the most infamous dehumanization word in history is the word nigger, right? If you want to, it's not just for killing people. If you want to oppress people, you have to dehumanize them. You can't think that black children are like your children if you have slavery. You got to think they're different from you. So the word nigger is a very common dehumanization word in order to allow slavery, segregation, all these different things. And this is true in every culture. Every war, oppression, you need some sort of dehumanization, right? So, psychological distance. The second form of distance is moral distance. Moral distance means I'm good, you're evil, and God is on my side. And that's why civil wars are so bloody. Because during a civil war, you look like the people you're fighting, you have the same language, customs, and traditions as them, so moral distance is used to make people believe that if you kill the enemy, you're expelling evil from the world. So if you listen to the Iraq War rhetoric, right? Think about all the speeches prior to the Iraq War. You saw very little psychological distance, you saw a lot of moral distance. So if you listen to the Iraq War rhetoric, the speeches, President Bush or whoever was in power would say, the Iraqi people are just like us. They want freedom, they want democracy, they want education, and we have to liberate these suffering people from this tyrant, from these evil people. The women in Afghanistan, they're just like our women. They want education, they want democracy, they want to go to school, and we have to liberate these poor, suffering people from the evil Taliban, from these evil terrorists. Because it's harder to dehumanize people now than it was in the World War II era. You can't just blatantly call people subhuman now. So the propaganda has become a lot more sophisticated, right? The Iraqi people are just like us. They want democracy. We're going to go over there and they're going to welcome us with open arms and greet us as liberators because they want freedom and they want democracy and they're just like us. But we have to liberate these people from these evil terrorists, these evil gangsters, these evildoers, these tyrants. We have to liberate these people. The third form of distance is mechanical distance. Mechanical distance means that it's easier to drop a bomb on someone at 10,000 feet than it is to shoot them with a rifle at 300 yards. It's easier to shoot somebody with a rifle at 300 yards than it is to stab them with a knife at close range. So the farther away you are from someone, the easier it is to kill them. So if you drop a bomb at 10,000 feet and people look like ants, it's a lot easier to kill them than if they're this far away from you and they look like your mother or your father or they remind you of people you know. Right? So you have mechanical distance through bombs, artillery, rifles, things like that. So here's a question. Why did the Nazis use the gas chamber? Why do you think the Nazis used the gas chamber?
Because it was so safe for different soldiers.
Right. There's a myth out there that the Nazis used the gas chamber because it was efficient. But there's nothing more efficient than a firing squad. There's nothing more efficient than lining people up, making them dig a ditch that will become their grave, making them stand in their grave, and shooting them with inexpensive bullets. The Nazis killed nearly 1 million people with firing squads, but they switched to the gas chamber because so many Nazi soldiers were becoming traumatized from killing women and children. And if you look at Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, if you look at Adolf Eichmann, their rationale was we have to protect the executioner. Right? The Nazi soldiers had mothers, many of them had sisters, some of them had daughters. Some of them can handle it. You got that 2%, but most of them could not handle it. So protecting the executioner. When people are being executed, whether it's firing squad or hanging or electric chair, why are their faces almost always covered? It's to protect the executioner, right? When gangsters execute people, what do they almost always shoot them? Back of the head. Almost always shoot people in the back of the head. Don't want to see their face, right? Now, the reason I'm sharing this again is think of propaganda like a magic trick. Okay, it's like a magic trick. Once you know how the trick is done, you can see right through it. So, David Copperfield can do this trick and just completely amaze you and trick you and fool you. But once you see how his trick is done, he can't fool you anymore. So you have to look at propaganda like magic. It's an illusion. So when you hear any politician talk about, we're good, they're evil, we got to liberate these people, we got to fight for self-defense, you go, wait a minute, I've heard this before. I've seen this trick done before. And I'm really skeptical now what I'm hearing, because I've heard this before. Self-defense, we're good, they're evil. I'm a little bit skeptical because I've seen this trick performed many times before. So again, think of propaganda like a magic trick. I'm trying to show you how these tricks are being done. So you can see right through the illusion. So if you look at the Holocaust, a massacre as big as the Holocaust required all three forms of dehumanization. Psychological, moral, mechanical distance. Required all three forms. But think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would every country in history, without a single exception, have to dehumanize the enemy in order to wage war? Why would every country in history, without one exception, have to create distance in order to wage war? And why would it be so hard to hurt or kill somebody if you see that person as a human being? If you see a person as a human being like you, it's very hard to hurt or kill them. So you need that dehumanization process to protect your mind from what you're doing, right? It's a lot easier psychologically to kill a bunch of monsters who want to come kill your family than to kill people who have families who are just like you. It's a lot easier on the conscience to kill monsters than to kill people. And that's why dehumanization is so prevalent throughout history, to make war possible. Now, what's a phobia? Irrational, uncontrollable fear, right? So, what's an example of a phobia? Snakes, right? Spiders? flying. About 15% of people are afraid of snakes. There's something Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman calls the universal human phobia. There is something out there that 98% of people have a phobic level reaction to. 98% of people are terrified of what? Have a phobic level reaction to what? Death. This is a bigger fear than death. Oh, public speaking. Actually, when I give you the answer, you'll understand why public speaking is so terrifying to people. It's human aggression directed at them. Bigger fear than death. Every year in America, tens of thousands of people die in car wrecks. Every day, millions of people casually drive to work. Every year in America, hundreds of thousands of people die from cigarette smoke. Every day, millions of people casually smoke. But if there is one serial killer in a town and that serial killer kills 2 people, the whole town goes upside down. One terrorist attack in America dramatically alters our entire way of life. If you look at one terrorist attack kills 3,000 people, that many people are killed every couple months in America from car wrecks. But it doesn't dramatically alter our way of life. When a human being is aggressive, that's where you become truly terrified. And this is why public speaking is so terrifying, because in your mind, in the back of your mind, the worst case scenario is you're going to say something that's going to evoke the audience's aggression. They're going to yell at you, they're going to humiliate you, they're going to become aggressive toward you. That's why people are afraid of public speaking. They're worried about the humiliation and the aggression on behalf of the audience erupting. And take these 2 scenarios. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman talks about this universal human phobia. Take these 2 scenarios. All right? Tell me which scenario is more traumatic. What's more traumatic? First scenario. A tornado comes through your town, knocks your house down, destroys everything you own, puts your family in the hospital. Second scenario, a gang breaks into your house, beats up you and your family, puts your family in the hospital, burns your house down. Which scenario is more traumatic? Far more traumatic. It was when the gang does it. Here's another couple scenarios. Which is more traumatic? You're riding your bike, you fall down off your bike, break your leg. Second scenario, you're riding your bike, a group of attackers pull you off your bike, hold you down, and break your leg with a baseball bat. Which is more traumatic? Now, the physical result is the same in both cases, right? The first case, your house is destroyed, your family's in the hospital. Second case, your leg is broken. But when a human does it to you, it's so much more traumatizing. And this is why terrorism is so dangerous. The reason terrorism is so dangerous is the way we react to it, right? When a terrorist attack happens, the universal human phobia is ignited. And if the government says, you know, we got to torture, we got to spy on our own people, we got to take away our civil liberties, people will do almost anything for safety and protection because that fear is so enormous. And this is why terrorism is so dangerous. The reason why terrorism is so dangerous is the way we react to terrorism. Because it ignites the universal human phobia, and the government can restrict freedoms and liberties out of the name of fighting terrorism. So we got to understand how this magic trick works, right? If there's an enemy threat, any of you remember the story of Chicken Little? So we know for a fact that when you're afraid, the critical thinking part of your brain shuts down. You literally cannot think straight when you're afraid. So in the story of Chicken Little says the sky's falling, and all the animals get into a panic and freak out, and they're panicking, and the fox says, hey everybody, come in my den and you'll all be safe. All the animals go in the den, and the fox eats the animals. So if I get you afraid enough, if I tell you, okay, everyone in this room, in 30 seconds, someone's going to come in that door and kill all of us. And let's say you believe me. You will do almost anything I tell you to do. If you truly believe that someone's going to come kill all of us right now, and the only way to survive is to do what I tell you to do, you will do almost anything I tell you to do. So governments do this, right? Governments get the population afraid and say, the only way to protect you and your family is to do what we say, and we got to bomb these people over there. Okay? Again, it's a magic trick. And you got to see through the illusion. So another question. Okay? Let's say you have a pack of wolves and a grizzly bear. Pack of wolves and a grizzly bear. Pack of wolves is hungry, grizzly bear is hungry, and there's a dead deer carcass. And they both want the dead deer carcass. What almost always happens? Yes. Oh, it depends. It depends how many wolves there are. It depends how big the bear is. It might be a young bear. It might be an older bear. It depends. It might be 3 wolves. It might be a grizzly bear. It might be 5 wolves. It might be a black bear. So it depends. But how did they figure that out? Who wins? What did they do? Size. Think about it. You got a big grizzly bear, massive animal, and you got 4 or 5 wolves. That's an interesting confrontation because you have numbers versus size and strength. Yes. Great answer. They don't actually fight, though. They don't fight, they don't share, they do something else in between. Intimidation. Think about why does a bear roar? Why does a bear roar? Why do wolves growl? If you look at their behavior, the wolves growl and roar, the wolves will growl, the bear will roar, stand up in its hind legs, roar, and typically through that intimidation process called posturing or warning aggression, one animal will leave through that intimidation process. And nearly all animals posture. When a rattlesnake shakes his tail, what is it telling you to do? If you walk in the street and a rattlesnake shakes his tail, what is it telling you to do? What is it communicating to you? Is it saying, hey, come pet me? What's it telling you to do? It's saying, go the other direction. And it's warning you. It goes, I don't want to have to bite you. I don't want to have to risk getting in a fight. Because you're bigger than me. I want you to go the other way. When a cobra goes up and spreads its hood and hisses, it's warning you, get away. If you look at a gorilla beats its chest. Lions roar. Tarantula will lift its front legs and show its fangs. Almost all animals posture. And it's a form of aggression intended to deter violence. Most aggression in nature is nonviolent in nature. Most aggression in nature is meant to deter violent confrontation. Now, why do animals try to deter violent confrontation? If they're hunting, they have to attack. But if they're not hunting, why do they try to deter violence? What's behind that? Survival. Violence in the wild is dangerous, right? If you're a bear and you fight a couple wolves, even if you kill the wolves, you might break your leg, you might break your jaw, you might get bit, die from infection. I mean, keep in mind, these animals have very dangerous natural weapons. Fangs, horns, claws. There's no emergency rooms. If you get injured, it's going to be a bad day. So animals try to deter violence through posturing, right? Through warning aggression. Now, do human beings posture? Do human beings use warning aggression? What are examples of human beings? Every animal does this. What are examples of human beings doing this? Yelling and shouting, right? If you look at 2 men about to get in a fight, what do they always do? Every time they stand up tall, they puff their chest out and they scream. Stand up tall, puff their chest out and scream. Do you ever see 2 men get in a fight and they walk up to each other like this? Right? Stand up tall, puff your chest out and scream, and then push the other guy. Show him how strong you are. Show him how strong you are. Maybe he'll back down, go the other way. If you look at the ancient wars, why did the Greeks have those big helmets with the big plume sticking out the top? What purpose does that serve? You know, big helmet with a big plume sticking out. Or they go into battle screaming. Always go into battle screaming at the top of their lungs. The posture to try to frighten away the enemy. And this is why the gun became so popular. This is why the gun is such a popular weapon. If you look at the English longbow and the English longbow and the crossbow had longer range, higher firing rate, and better accuracy than the musket, but they made a bigger noise when they fired. So if you have a guy with a bow and arrow going point, 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 and a guy with a musket going bang, 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 the guy with the musket feels so much more secure. And Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman calls this the Bigger Bang Theory. The Bigger Bang Theory. Whatever army has the louder noise has a significant psychological advantage in war. And Napoleon said, in war, the psychological is to the physical is 3-to-1. So this is why this is relevant today. If you look at nuclear weapons, that's the part of the brain nuclear weapons tap into is the posturing instinct. Having a whole bunch of nuclear weapons is like showing your teeth. Having a whole bunch of nuclear weapons is like showing your teeth. If you so much as look at us the wrong way, we can bite you, right? We have all these nuclear weapons. We'll let you know how many we have so you know not to mess with us. And it's this warning aggression. So the government say these evil people are coming. They want to come kill us and take away our freedom and kill our family. And these nuclear weapons work as a deterrent. right? It's like showing your teeth, letting the enemy know, keep away from us. So it's important to understand the psychology of nuclear weapons, because people believe they make them safe. People don't like nuclear weapons because they want the world to be destroyed. They like nuclear weapons because they think that nuclear weapons create peace. Right? What was that nuclear missile during the Cold War? The Peacekeeper. Or if you look at Strategic Air Command, which was in charge of the nuclear weapons arsenal, what was their motto? Peace is our profession, if I remember correctly. So we view war as peace. Now, let's say you're walking down... Okay, this is a little bit more graphic. But it's important to understand this behavior, because if we don't understand this behavior, we cannot cure it. And when people hear about it and don't understand it, they go, oh, that's just human beings being naturally violent. Again, that's just human beings being naturally violent. That's just human nature. People don't think, wait a minute, that has a cause, and there's a way to prevent that cause. So the next part's a little bit more graphic. But it's important to understand, especially with everything you're hearing now in the media. It's important, next time you hear a story like this, you can conceptualize what's going on. So, let's say you're walking down, you have our ancestors right there on the African savanna. We're very slow creatures. We can't quickly climb trees. We can't run fast. We're physically weak compared to chimpanzees and gorillas. We have no natural weapons, no fangs, no tusks, no horns. We're very vulnerable creatures on the African savanna. We're being hunted by lion, leopard, hyena. How did we survive? Think about a human tribe of 30 people. You've got pregnant women, elderly, infants, and you have a pride of lions. Zebra can run away, but we're not fast enough. So what do? Think about that. What happens when you see your loved ones threatened? You become extremely aggressive, and you probably posture. And imagine everyone you love being threatened by a pride of lions. You are going to freak out. You're going to go and become extremely aggressive, throw rocks, right? Wave a stick, wave a spear, make a whole bunch of noise. And now the lions go, okay, this is a dangerous prey. Let me think about this. This prey is dangerous, especially if they know they're spotted. And if you look at war taps into that part of the human brain. Our family's in danger by these evil predators. These evil predators want to come kill our family, and we have to protect our family. That's how all the war propaganda is framed. I mean, you never hear war propaganda that says, well, these are good people, but we want to go take their resources, and we want you to go die so rich people can get richer. And that's it. You never hear war propaganda like that. Now, what if you're walking down the African savanna and a leopard jumps up on your back? A leopard just sneaks up on you, that's what they do, jumps up on your back, and you are 5 seconds away from being killed. You have 5 seconds to do something to keep yourself alive. What do? Now, if it takes you more than 5 seconds to think of something, you're already dead. Play dead, they'll still eat you. I mean, think about leopards are scavengers, right? Leopards, lions, hyena, they're all scavengers. If there's a dead carcass and there's hyena eating a dead carcass, lion will go up and chase the hyena away and eat the dead carcass. They'll eat dead animals. They won't eat animals if they're severely decomposed, but keep in mind, all those predators are scavengers. They will all eat dead animals. How do you get it off of you? Poke it in the eyes. Think about that. If you gouge out the leopard's eye, it might get off of you. If you rip off the leopard's genitals, it might get off of you. If you bite off its ear, if you bite off his nose, if you rip off a piece of his nose, it might get off of you. Now, this is being well documented in war. This behavior in war is called going berserk. Going berserk. So here's what happens when people go berserk. When you go berserk, you're completely trapped. You're trapped into a corner, and you feel that your death is imminent. And think of it like a Hail Mary pass. Like you're about to die, and this is your only way to stay alive. And the interesting thing about war is in war, many people don't go berserk. Probably most people don't go berserk. But a percentage of people go berserk in those circumstances. So this is why in the Art of War, Sun Tzu says, never trap an army into a corner. always give an army an escape route. If you trap an army into a corner where it can't escape, it's extremely dangerous. That army might go berserk and come right at you. So you always give an army a way to run away. Now, the berserk behavior is well documented in war. Going back to the Iliad, if you look at the Iliad, Achilles goes berserk. Achilles in the Iliad demonstrates all the characteristics of berserk behavior in the Iliad. Just loses his mind. And there's several different characteristics of berserk behavior. Okay? First of all, you're trapped. You're backed into a corner and you feel your death is imminent. You're going to die, and something in your brain snaps. Something in your brain breaks, and you go berserk. And you go into this frenzy. So a few characteristics of berserk behavior are that you can't feel physical pain. Another one is that you feel invincible. So you're not worried about getting hurt. All your focus is on causing damage. You can't feel physical pain. You feel indestructible. You feel godlike. Another thing is people can go berserk to different degrees. Some people can go berserk to kind of a moderate degree. Some people can go berserk to a very high degree. In Frederick Douglass's autobiography, his first narrative, there's an example where he seems to go berserk to a moderate degree, where he just loses concern for his life and he attacks a group of white people after they've beaten him. When people go berserk to a high degree, there's a fixation on damaging reproductive and sensory organs. So when this happens in war, people start cutting off people's ears, gouging out their eyes, cutting off their genitals. And this comes from that berserk mindset. This fixation, because again, it's hard to look at people's faces when you kill them, but when the berserk mindset happens, you have this fixation on damaging reproductive and sensory organs in order to stay alive. So if a predator jumps on you, and if a leopard jumps on you and you fight it off, the leopard goes away and you're safe. But in war, if you go berserk, you're still in war. So you have this lingering berserk behavior. And you have soldiers committing lots of atrocities. You have soldiers mutilating corpses, gouging out people's eyes, cutting off their noses, cutting off their ears. Another characteristic of berserk behavior when it's very high degree is you cannot distinguish between an enemy combatant and a civilian. Like your brain loses the ability to distinguish. So in your mind, everything is a leopard. Everything you see every living creature you see is a leopard. A woman is a leopard. A baby is a leopard. A child is a leopard. And you just kill everything you see. So when you look at war atrocities or you look at violent crime, you have violent crime and people go, oh, that's just naturally violent. It's like people getting cancer and people going, oh, we're naturally cancerous. People don't think there might be a cause for disease. And how do we cure that, right? If people get malaria or cancer or the flu, we think there's a cause. How do we cure the cause? How do we prevent the cause? We don't just think, well, that's just natural. We try to figure out how to stop it. And if you look at violent crime, war, this happens to a very high degree. So it's important to understand all this behavior because although humans aren't naturally violent, I'm not saying we can't become violent. We can certainly become violent. We're not supposed to be ill. We're not supposed to be sick, but lots of ways people can become sick. So you have to understand what are all the ways people become violent, what causes war, what causes violent crime, and then we can remedy those things. And that's one reason I got into this whole peace thing. My father, he had a lot of trauma from the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and he was extremely violent when I was growing up, and I was beaten up a lot, and I grew up with a very violent temper. And one reason I got into this whole peace thing was thinking, how do I control my own violent temper? But I wasn't born that way, I became conditioned. So if you look at the violent criminal population, the vast majority of people in the violent criminal population were abused growing up. So if you beat people, and you bully people, and you abuse people, and you condition people, you can make people very, very violent. Through the right abuse, through the right conditioning, through the right training, you can make people violent. Look at violent crime. So we have to understand how we can remedy that. How much more time is there? Okay. Okay. So, now how do we remedy that? Let's talk about Gandhi and nonviolence. Okay, that's the medicine, right? The medicine for violence is It's not just about ending war, it's about reducing violent crime, reducing oppression, reducing racism, reducing all these different problems and dehumanization. When you think about dehumanization, think about how many problems are caused by dehumanization. Slavery, oppression, war, genocide, sexism is caused by dehumanization, viewing women as subhuman or viewing women as sex objects is caused by dehumanization. If you think about dehumanization just in itself, think about how many problems is caused by that. So what's the medicine? Well, the medicine is nonviolence, okay? So, raise your hand if you've studied Gandhi. Okay? Or raise your hand if you admire Gandhi. Okay. Now, Gandhi's really interesting. Okay? Some of you heard me say this earlier, but raise your hand if you knew that Gandhi was a military recruiter. Gandhi was a military recruiter 4 different times. He was a military recruiter in 1899 for the Boer War. He was a military recruiter in 1906 for the Zulu War. He was a military recruiter in 1914 for World War I. All 3 times he was recruiting Indians to be medics. In 1918, he was recruiting Indians to fight in the infantry. And Gandhi served in the Boer and Zulu Wars as a medic. He was a sergeant major. He had the same military rank my father had. He was a sergeant major. And he was awarded the War Medal by the British Empire. And raise your hand if you knew that Gandhi supported the Polish violent uprising against Nazi Germany. I mean, Gandhi supported the Polish violent resistance against Nazi Germany. And Gandhi resented the fact that the British wouldn't let all the Indians serve in the military. So what's going on here? I mean, Gandhi's the great peacemaker, but he's very pro-military. He wants soldiers and he wants activists to be like soldiers. So here's where Gandhi's coming from. A basic principle for military strategy: you never fight your opponent where they're strongest, you always fight them where they're weakest. Never fight your opponent where they're strongest, always fight them where they're weakest. Basic principle for military strategy, and it's just common sense. Don't fight an opponent where they're strongest, fight them where they're weakest. So if you look at the American system, if you look at segregation and Martin Luther King Jr., where was the American government strongest? Where was the American government, British Empire, where were they strongest? What's their strongest point? Military, violence, right? American government controls the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, National Guard, FBI, CIA, and police. And you want to use violence against them on their own soil? You're going to get wiped out. That's madness. People, they think it's cool to talk about violent uprising. They have no idea what they're in for. They're going to get wiped out and crushed. So during the Zulu War, Gandhi was a medic, and he saw the Zulus getting crushed by the British. The British had the most powerful empire in the world at that time, and they're getting crushed by the British. And he saw how the Zulu violent uprising allowed the British to consolidate more control. And it reminded him of the violent uprising in India in 1857, where there was a violent uprising in India in 1857, and it allowed the British to gain more control and consolidate power. Because they were able to crush the violent rebellion and then become more controlling in the name of self-defense and peace. And they were fighting terrorists and evildoers to keep the peace and order. So never fight them where they're strongest, fight them where they're weakest. So where is any oppressive system weakest? What's their weakest point? What do you think? Their weakest point is moral authority. If you confront them on the level of moral authority, they cannot defeat you. If you challenge them on the moral ground, they cannot defeat you. So the civil rights movement was nonviolent, right? They challenged the segregation system nonviolently. Every time they get attacked violently, their movement becomes more powerful. Every time they get attacked, and it's on national television, people have more sympathy for the movement, and the movement becomes more popular and more powerful. So every time they attack you, they actually make your movement stronger. Every time Gandhi's movement was attacked, his movement became more popular, more powerful. They put you in prison, they make you more popular. And the worst thing they can do is kill you. The worst thing they can do is kill you. This is why the apartheid government never killed Mandela, and this is why the Burmese government never killed Aung San Suu Kyi. Because if they kill you, they actually make you way more powerful. Any of you seen Star Wars? Any of you remember the last words of Obi-Wan Kenobi right before Darth Vader kills him? So right before Darth Vader kills Obi-Wan Kenobi, what does Obi-Wan Kenobi say?
Even if you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you.
Exactly. He goes, great. He goes, "You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can possibly imagine." So I saw a political cartoon that was released in the newspaper right after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. And it was a political cartoon of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and Gandhi is speaking to King. And Gandhi says to King, he says, "The strange things about assassins, Dr. King, is they think they've killed you. So you turn them into an idea if you kill them." And this is why nonviolence is more effective. It's so extremely effective. And Gandhi said, "People listen to me because I showed them how to give fight to the British when they had no arms, and the British were fully equipped and organized for an armed fight." And then he said, "Nonviolence is the most effective weapon." He said, "Nonviolence is more effective than any other weapon. In fact, the mightiest force in the world." He said, "Nonviolence is more effective than any other weapon. In fact, the mightiest force in the world." So he referred to it as a weapon. He realized oppressed people need a new way to fight imperialism and oppression that doesn't meet the oppressor where the oppressor is strongest, but meets the oppressor where the oppressor is weakest. So I hear a lot of people say, well, the world would have been a lot better off if Martin Luther King Jr. would have been violent. A lot more would have been accomplished in the civil rights movement if that movement would have been violent, all across the board. It should have been a violent movement. Look at Haiti, right? Haiti got their freedom violently. That's what I hear people say. Haiti got their freedom violently. Why didn't we do that? Why didn't we do what Haiti did? Think about that. What's different about Haiti and the U.S.? Why was Haiti able to get their freedom violently, and why would that not have worked here? Great point. What Che Guevara did worked against Cuba. Cuba had a really weak military. But if Che Guevara would have used that against the U.S. on American territory, he would have been wiped out. You cannot fight the most powerful military in human history on its own soil with violence. It's going to crush you. Cuba had a weak military. Haiti had something else going on, though. If you look at Haiti, Haiti had about 40,000 whites, about 30,000 free blacks, and over 500,000 slaves. So the slave population greatly outnumbered the white population. So in Haiti, the slave population outnumbered the white population maybe 7 or 8 to 1. In America, the proportions are reversed. The whites outnumber the African Americans 7 or 8 to 1, where the African Americans are maybe 15-20% of the population max. And the oppressor is going to have better weapons, better resources, more food, more money, more supplies, a better trained military. They're going to crush you. You at least have to outnumber the oppressor to have a chance of beating them. Because they're going to have better resources, better training, better equipment, better military, and you're an impoverished, oppressed people who probably don't even have any weapons. So how are you going to fight the oppressor, especially when they outnumber you 7 or 8 to 1? And in the war with the violent rebellion in Haiti, there were over 100,000 slaves killed. Now, if Haiti would have had the same proportions of black to white as we had in America, you would have had 40,000 free white, maybe 8, 10, 12,000 slaves. No chance against those kinds of odds, especially when the oppressor has more firepower. And that is why these techniques are so brilliant, fighting the oppressor in a completely different way that doesn't meet them where they're strongest, but meets them where they're weakest. So people have a completely distorted view of how violence works. They don't realize how ineffective it is. If you look at violent revolutions, when they do happen, you typically need the support of another powerful nation. The Americans would not have won the American Revolution without the support of the French. You needed the support of another empire to win against an empire. If you look at the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese had the help of the Soviets and the Chinese. When the Afghans fought the Russians, they had the help of the Americans. So if you do have a violent uprising and you don't have the ability to do a coup, if you don't have that ability to do a coup, you need some sort of foreign aid, usually. So if you look at what was the most militarized culture in human history? What was the most militarized culture in human history? Sparta, right? Sparta, you left age 7, if you're a male citizen, start military training. You do military training from age 7 to age 18. You serve in the military from age 20 to age 60. And every male had to be full-time military, forbidden from any other occupation other than warfare. There's never been a culture like that was so militarized as Sparta. Now, why were the Spartans so militarized? Why were they so incredibly militarized compared to other Greek city-states? Pardon?
Smaller population.
Great point. Now, keep in mind, there were other Greek city-states that had small population, but you're right, the Spartans did have a small population. But there was a point where they actually became militarized. Way more militarized than the other Greek city-states. What do you think? So here's a question. If the Spartan men were all full-time military, who was doing all the work? Slaves. They had a massive slave population. If you look at ancient Athens in 400 BC, about 30% of the people were slaves. If you look at Sparta in 400 BC, the slaves outnumbered the Spartans 7-1. And the Helots, they were called Helots, they were rebelling. They were fighting wars against the Spartans, and they could not beat the Spartans. Even though they outnumbered them 7-1, they could not defeat the Spartans. And it wasn't until a foreign army, the Theban general Epaminondas, invaded Sparta, freed the slaves, helped them fortify a city, that they were finally free. You needed foreign intervention. If you look at Spartacus, Rome had a series of 3 slave revolts. 3 slave revolts happened. The 3rd slave revolt was the slave revolt of Spartacus. Any of you heard of Spartacus? So Spartacus, he was a gladiator. Him and about 70 other gladiators broke out of a gladiator school with kitchen utensils, used kitchen utensils as weapons. And within a few years, Spartacus raised an army of about 100,000 people to fight the Romans. That's a huge army, about 100,000 people led by a gladiator to fight the Romans, and the army was just wiped out. The Romans at first didn't take it seriously. Threw some troops at it, troops were getting killed. They realized, okay, Spartacus is a threat, sent in their major army, their good commander, crushed it. Killed Spartacus in combat, captured 6,000 of the soldiers in Spartacus' army, crucified all 6,000 soldiers on the main road to Rome. As a warning to rebels, if you think about rebelling against the Roman Empire, here's what's in store for you. So you're going to hear people talk about violence. You're going to hear, as the Occupy movement becomes frustrated, and people don't see change happening as quickly as they want it to happen, people are going to think about violence. They're going to say, it's not working. This Gandhian king stuff doesn't work. We got to get violent. And you got to be able to articulate to them why that is not going to work. The other thing about nonviolence is it transforms how people think, right? You do not view your opponent as this person. Your opponent isn't these people. Your opponent is hatred. Your opponent is ignorance. Your opponent is greed. And nonviolence gives you a way to attack people's ignorance, to attack their hatred, to attack their greed in a way that transforms them. So if you attack hatred with hatred, it amplifies the hatred. If you attack hatred with love, you have a chance to extinguish the hatred. And this has been proven to work. If you look at King Gandhi, apartheid in South Africa, many different movements where this has been effective. And I'm evidence of the fact that this has been effective throughout history. So, one reason I joined the military is I was taught when I was a kid, well, you need violence to stop violence. You need war to stop war. That's what we're taught growing up. If you read comic books, how does Superman and Batman save the world? Do they have a negotiation? Does Batman say, hey Joker, let's talk this out? Or he beats the crap out of him, right? That's what superheroes do. If you look at action movies, video games, you need violence to stop violence. And I grew up believing that. I grew up very conservative. I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh every day in high school. Used to listen to G. Gordon Liddy every day in high school. Used to listen to Sean Hannity on local radio before he became nationally famous. And my parents weren't that politically aware, but that was my own ambition. I liked what they had to say. I liked what Rush Limbaugh had to say about America. And I grew up in Alabama. I grew up very conservative. And another reason I joined the Army, not only believing war makes us safe, because most people join the Army thinking that they're making the world safer. If you listen to President Obama or President Bush, they both say that we're promoting freedom, spreading democracy around the Middle East, fighting terrorism, making the world safer. So people join the Army thinking they're doing good. If you look at what every president says, were doing good, making the world safer, fighting terrorism, spreading freedom and democracy, liberating people. Another reason I joined the Army is my father was half white and half black. My mother is Korean. Grew up in the South. My father was born in 1925, so he had me when he was 54 years old. And there was a generation skip between me and him because he was old enough to be my grandfather. And he was born the same year as Malcolm X, born 4 years before Martin Luther King Jr. And since I was a child, he told me the only place in America where a black man has a chance is in the Army. And that was his reality. The Army had desegregated prior to civil rights, and his reality was the only place he felt black men had an equal chance was in the Army in the 1940s and 1950s, which was largely true back then. And I remember being a kid, and he would look at the TV and say, look at that. Look at Colin Powell. Colin Powell is the highest-ranking person in the military. Where else is that possible? How many black CEOs do you see? Have you ever seen a black president? And this is he died in 2004 before Barack Obama became the first black president. But I grew up, I was shunned by the African American community because I looked Asian. I was shunned by the Asian community because I was part black. Not white, so it didn't really fit in. And my parents, they raised me to think like a person prior to civil rights. They said, if anyone finds out you're part black, they're going to turn on you. Being Asian and black is a really weird, freakish mixture, right? You don't fit in anywhere if you're Asian, black, and white. So I really was afraid of telling people I'm part black. And the first time I told someone I was part black, I was 22 years old. And the fear was enormous. I remember when I got out of the Army 3 years ago, my mother was furious. She goes, are you out of your mind? She goes, no one's going to give you a job. Who's going to hire a black man who looks Asian? Who's going to give a job to a black man who looks Asian? And that was how the world was not long ago. So I told the first person I was part black, told a few more people, and the response was positive. And they'd say, that's a really cool racial mixture. And I thought, what planet am I living on? I grew up as an Asian-looking person, but I grew up and I was taught to think like a black person living in the 19th century in terms of my racial views. And I thought, what planet am I living on? People think it's cool I'm multiracial. And it was like I was stuck in a time warp, and it was like I was stuck in a time warp, and I saw how much things had changed, right? So, what did the Founding Fathers talk about? This is the end of the talk. What did the Founding Fathers talk about? No taxation without representation. What does that mean? No taxation without representation. What does that mean? Yeah, we won't pay unless we're heard. You cannot tax me unless you give me a vote. You cannot tax me or tell me what to do unless you give me participation in the political process. In order to govern me, you have to get my consent to govern me. Right? That's a legitimate grievance. If you want to govern me, you have to get my consent. You can't just govern me without my consent. And if you're going to tax me, let me vote, let me participate. That was their battle cry, in many ways. Now, prior to the 1820s and 1830s, 50 years after the Revolutionary War, less than 10% of the American population could vote. Women couldn't vote, African Americans couldn't vote, Native Americans couldn't vote, most white people couldn't vote unless they owned land, right? So 40, 50 years after the Revolutionary War, most Americans didn't have the right to vote. If you look at 200 years ago, women in America couldn't vote, couldn't own property, couldn't go to college in most places, couldn't have a bank account, they were property. But how did women get all those rights? Did they fight a war to get those rights? They used nonviolent methods, right? If you look at the Civil War kept the Union together, but it took a peaceful movement during the Civil Rights era before African Americans truly got their human rights. It took a peaceful movement before they truly got their human rights. And how many European countries had a war to free the slaves? How many European countries had a war to free the slaves? 0. The non-landowners, did they fight a war to get the right to vote? They use nonviolent methods. Look at workers' rights. Look at child labor laws. So we're taught that we got all our freedom through war, but after the Revolutionary War, most Americans were not free people, and they got their freedom through nonviolent methods. So why aren't we taught that in school? Why aren't we taught that in school, that most of our progress and freedoms came through women's rights movement, civil rights movement, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King Jr., and these are popular people. These are important people. But people, they hear Martin Luther King Jr. and all they know is I have a dream speech, right? They're not really taught what happened. But we're not taught how these changes actually happen. And what percent of the American population made that change happen? What percent of the American population actively participated in the women's rights movement? Less than 1% of the population actively participated in the women's rights movement. Very small percentage actually participated. What percent of the American population actively participated in the civil rights movement? Less than 1% actively participated in those movements. That's why Henry David Thoreau said there are 999 patrons of virtue for every virtuous person. In other words, for every 1,000 people who think something's a good idea, one person does something about it. That's a fact of history. It takes a very small percentage of the population being very effective, very well trained to make change happen. But that 1% has to be very well trained, very effective. They have to be very well trained, effective, strategic-minded, creative, to change mass consensus. So now we have a lot of problems, and nonviolence is the way to solve those problems. And I hope that you'll all become part of the 1%, not the 2%. Thank you. Time for questions? Yeah.
We'll have just a couple of questions. I know we're running a little late, but if you'd like to engage in a question or two, please follow along.
I have a sign-up sheet I can pass around. We have a newsletter. And I teach a workshop in the summer, a peace leadership workshop, and people ask me a lot about my personal transformation. That's something I write more about. And some of the experiences are really traumatic. It's easier to write about than to talk about. So there's some books in the back if you'd like to learn more about that or the actual method to solve these problems. Because all I've really done in this talk is kind of clear up the propaganda, clear up the myths. And I write more about the path and my own transformation in the books. But here's a newsletter, if any of you curious. Any questions? Yes. Oh, yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you for the talk.
Oh, thank you.
My question relates to the fact that for the Iraq War, public opinion was against the use of violence. And now people are talking about Iran, and public opinion is again strongly against the use of violence. But we could see the circumstances arise where it might happen. It's pretty conceivable, especially if Israel decides that it wants to go to war with Iraq. I'm curious how the majority gets overruled in these circumstances. Like, the people in this room are probably on the peaceful side more than the more loving side. But we're in the majority, and how do we stop from going to war in the future when we know that we're stronger? I think what keeps us silent in large degree is this feeling like we're going to be made fun of, like instead of like standing up and speaking in public. Maybe is that what's stopping us, and how do we overcome?
Oh, great question. So, great question. So, yeah, it might be that popular support is against war now. Well, let's take a deeper look at that. That's a really good point. Now, I hear a lot of people say that the American government never learns from history. The American government is so stupid. It never learned from the Vietnam War. If the American government would have learned from history and would have learned from the Vietnam War, we would have never gone into Iraq and Afghanistan. Didn't the American government learn anything from Vietnam? How could we go to Iraq and Afghanistan? But the reason we went into Iraq and Afghanistan is precisely because the American government learned so much from the Vietnam War. The American government learned a lot from the Vietnam War. It learned 4 primary things. What's the most important thing the American government learned from the Vietnam War?
They privatized the army.
Great. Privatize the army. That's a critical one. I'll talk about that one next, but and great point. Now, the most important thing that the government did was they got rid of the draft. Draft is gone. Draft is gone. Now, I heard a lecture by Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, he's a critic of American foreign policy. He said that he would give a talk in the early 60s about the Vietnam War in Boston, liberal town, and 4 people would show up to his talk. The person who organized the talk, the preacher of the church where he was speaking, a drunk who walked in off the street, and somebody who wanted to kill him. And he goes, nobody cared. He said Kennedy bombed South Vietnam in the early 60s and nobody cared. And what happened? And they would have peace protests. And they would have to bring in the police to protect the peace protesters from students. Students would try to attack the peace protesters. But what changed was a draft happened. When they started drafting kids to go to war, it became immediate to people. Their children, their brother, their friend's going to have to go. And now it's an immediate issue. If we had a draft that started today, and they were going to draft kids from URI to go fight in Iran, we'd have a lot more people at the peace vigil tonight. Right? Probably have rioting. So the government realized we have to get rid of this draft to separate the American population from war. Prior to the Iraq War, millions of people all over the world protested the war before it ever began. That's never before happened in human history. It was years before people cared about the Vietnam War. We were bombing South Vietnam, most people just didn't care. But prior to the Iraq War, millions of people all over the world protested the war before it ever began, never before happened in human history. So first thing the government did, got rid of the draft. And that, if we brought back the draft, you would have mass protests against war. People would be involved. So yeah, maybe popular support is against war, but the people are apathetic. They just don't really care either way. They say, yeah, I don't really want war, but I'm not really paying much attention. So Henry David Thoreau said that there are millions of people who are in opinion against slavery and war, but who do nothing about it. And that's why Martin Luther King Jr. said that the opposite of evil isn't hatred, the opposite of evil is apathy, right? It's the apathetic good people who allow injustice to happen more so than the bad people, the apathetic good people. So second thing the government learned from the Vietnam War is privatize the military. If you privatize the military, you further separate the population from war. So if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, there were more civilian contractors than soldiers in those wars. And when you hear 3,000 dead American soldiers, what you don't hear is how many dead contractors are there. Nobody counts dead contractors. So if we didn't have a contractor army, we'd have many more than 3,000 soldiers killed, but nobody counts dead contractors. Another thing about a privatized military is a lot of the people are foreign nationals, and it's very, very profitable for corporations to have these corporate armies. The third thing the government learned was embed journalists in military units. Embed the journalists in the military units. You don't want them to be going around reporting. So you embed them in the military unit. And they develop camaraderie with the soldiers, right? The soldiers were protecting them. They develop camaraderie with the soldiers. And that's very important. And number 4, this is a big one. Tell people if they don't support the war, they don't support the troops. If you don't support the war, you don't support the troops. If you question the war, you don't support the troops. And now all those things were in place. And that has really shut down the war opposition. Now ask yourself this, okay? If President Bush were using drone strikes in Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan like President Obama is, people would be freaking out. Think about the peace movement. And think about if President Bush were using drone strikes in all these different countries, and if President Bush authorized a war campaign against Libya. People would have been freaking out. When the Obama administration said that if Syria gets chemical weapons, we're going to go to war with them potentially, or we might intervene. If that would have been President Bush, people would be freaking out. If President Bush had surged in Afghanistan, so even President Obama being elected had kind of shut down the peace movement because people thought, well, it's just President Bush. When we have to understand it's a deeper issue. Both political parties are part of the war paradigm. They're both part of the war paradigm. At the 1952 Republican National Convention, General MacArthur said that he was talking about the Democratic Party, and one reason he opposed the Democratic Party was he said they waged too many wars. I met a woman last week in Ohio, and she was a little girl in the 1950s, and her parents were very staunch Republicans. And she asked her mother, she goes, if the Republicans support the rich and we're poor, why are we Republicans? And her mother said, because the Democrats start all the wars. So if you look at World War I, Democrats. World War II, Democrats. Korean War, Democrats. Vietnam War, even though Eisenhower sent advisors there, it was Kennedy and Johnson who really escalated. And now both parties are they're part of the war paradigm. If you look at President Clinton, right, he did bombing campaigns. You look at President Obama's drone missions and what we're doing in Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan. So we have to understand, it's not that simple. People thought that President Bush was going to get out of office and we'd have world peace. But it's a much deeper issue than that. President Bush, I mean, some of his positions sound moderate compared to the Romney-Ryan campaign, in retrospect. If you look at Reagan sounds moderate to a lot of things you hear now. So there's an underlying thing going on, right? And we have to understand the deeper issues and the deeper causes. Yes?
Just quickly, I'd like to say that this is shameless self-promotion, but I'm running as an independent for Congress this year, and part of my platform is to run on a peace ticket. So thank you for saying that. I think you're right. I think one of the things that I've seen happen to me as I'm running is, rather than working on an issue where I might take a strong stance on peace, the tactic of people is just to marginalize me by ignoring me entirely, so not to debate me at all. And so I guess what I do like to say is to appeal to the people in the audience, that's what they're going to do. They're going to try and marginalize us and not let the majority be heard. And we have to try and stand up and change that ourselves.
Right.
Because they're not going to do it on their own.
That's a great point, and I really wish you success. We need a peace platform, and we got to keep in mind the reason Americans support the war paradigm, they think war makes them safe. If you believe that war protects your family and your freedom and your way of life and your children, and I tell you we need to spend money on war, how much are you willing to spend? If you truly believe that war protects your freedom and your safety and your family and your children, and I say we need 90 cents of every taxpayer dollar to go to war, you're going to accept it. So you have to keep in mind, to the majority of Americans, the military budget is the security budget, it's the peace budget, it's the freedom budget, it's the jobs budget. So if you don't first show people that war doesn't make them safe and war makes them less safe, they're going to become very hostile if you threaten to cut the military budget. They're going to say, this weird, unpatriotic, un-American person wants to put my children at risk. The military protects my children, and they want to put my family at risk. And we have to show that war doesn't make us safe, and we have to also offer a more effective security paradigm. We can't just say no war. We have to offer a better way to make our country safe, a better way to protect national security than warfare, which is a pretty comprehensive method that I outlined. But this can happen, right? I mean, 200 years ago in America, or today in America, if any American politician were to say that we should bring back slavery, bring back segregation, women shouldn't be able to vote or own property, people would look at him like he's insane. But 200 years ago, that's how almost every American thought, and that's how most politicians spoke. So if we could dramatically change attitudes in America towards slavery and oppression of women and segregation, why can't we dramatically change attitudes in America toward war, environmental destruction, and other problems? Right? We look back 200 years ago and say, what was going on with those people? What were they thinking back then? I mean, slaves and women can't vote, and women can't own property. What was going on? 500 years ago, if you say the earth goes around the sun, people might kill you. What was going on back then? So we look back at those people almost like they're a little bit, off. And maybe in the future people look back at us and go, what were those people thinking? Bombing people, and what were they thinking? What was going on with those people? Yes, and then, yes.
Yeah. How do we deal with the psychopathic leaders that take power, who the Stalin and Hitler? What would your solution be to those problems?
Great. So, There's a lot of mythology about Hitler and Nazi Germany. So here's what Gandhi said about Hitler and Nazi Germany. Gandhi supported the Polish violent resistance against Nazi Germany, but Poland's a country. If you look at the Jews in Germany, Hitler greatly admired the Jews, greatly admired them. And at that point in time, the Western countries were not willing to help them. He said, Hitler is mad. This is 1938. Gandhi said, Hitler is mad. And if you look throughout history, Hitler has gone crazy to a point where you can't really find examples like that throughout history. Hitler is like more crazy than the tyrants of old. He's gone mad. And he said that the way the Jews are being persecuted in Germany, there's really no historical parallel for how bad that situation is. It's really, really terrible. And Hitler's out of his mind. And Gandhi said, it may be that Hitler cannot be persuaded. It may be that Hitler cannot be persuaded. But Hitler, how many people did Hitler kill? Other than himself. How many people did he physically kill himself? 0. Hitler is one of the least frightening people to be locked alone in a room with. I mean, like Kim Jong-il. I wouldn't be afraid to be locked in a room alone with Kim Jong-il. I'd be really afraid to be locked in a room alone with Jeffrey Dahmer. But keep in mind, Hitler doesn't kill people. He gets other people to kill for him. Now, what Gandhi said is if the German people truly knew what Hitler was doing, they would rebel against him and try to stop him. Now, and Hitler kept the Holocaust kind of quiet. And if you look at his speeches, peace, self-defense, right, human rights, all these noble things. And a good example of this is Stauffenberg. Any of you heard of Stauffenberg? So Stauffenberg, he was an officer in the German military, and he was a hardcore Nazi. Supported Hitler, supported the Nazi regime, and then he found out about the Holocaust. And he goes, Hitler has lost his mind, we need to kill him. Him and a bunch of other German officers got together and plotted to kill Hitler. And there were numerous assassination attempts against Hitler. When you actually read about all the times Hitler was almost killed, it is unbelievable that he survived. The Stauffenberg plot is called Operation Valkyrie. A bomb went off in a room with Hitler in the room. They actually got a bomb into a room. Hitler's in the room, the bomb explodes, and Hitler almost got killed. Hitler should have been killed by that bomb. They actually got a bomb into a room with Hitler, bomb goes off. So Stauffenberg, these other German officers realized we got to kill Hitler, end the war, free the concentration camp. So Gandhi said Hitler is terrible, but the German people as a whole aren't evil people. They're not being told, some of the Germans certainly support the Holocaust. You have the SS, you have Heinrich Himmler, you have people working in the concentration camps, but the majority of the German people aren't, Hitler isn't giving a speech bragging about these different things. He's giving a much more propagandized speech. Or the Jews are trying to hurt us. We have to stop them out of self-defense. They're trying to hurt us. The communists are trying to hurt us. But you have people like Stauffenberg trying to stop Hitler. And think of a warmonger. Think of Hitler like a parasite. Right? A parasite relies on the host to do all of the work. Someone like Hitler requires other people to do all of the work. So a parasite, if you separate the parasite from the host, the parasite dies. If you take Hitler away from the willing population, Hitler can't really hurt anybody. He needs other people to hurt people for him. And so if you look at Germany now, it's really hard to imagine Hitler coming to power now in Germany. It's possible, but again, propaganda is like a magic trick. The Germans kind of know how the magic trick is done. And when someone starts talking like Hitler, they go, okay, we've heard this before. We've seen this magic trick done before. We've seen its illusion done before. We know how this is done. And you have to create a society where it's really difficult for people to come to power with those warmongering views. And keeping in mind, people like Stalin, people like Hitler, people like Kim Jong-il, they're not really killing people. They're getting other people to kill for them, which makes them dangerous, but it also makes them very weak in a way, because if you don't get people to kill for them, then what can they do? And I think that we're taught, well, if we wouldn't have won World War II, we'd all be speaking German right now. And that's assuming that all the German people are evil, that the Germans would not have tried to stop him. And this is a historical fact. The German officers who found out about the Holocaust, a minority of them, not the majority, a minority of them were trying to kill Hitler. Not all the Germans were like Hitler. In Berlin, there were between 20,000 and 30,000 people in Berlin, non-Jewish Germans who tried to hide Jews. Between 20 and 30,000 in Berlin. Now, Berlin had a population of around 8 million people. So it's a very small population. But if you read about Operation Valkyrie, it is amazing that Hitler was not killed. A bomb goes off with Hitler in the room, Hitler survives. But if that bomb would have killed Hitler, we'd have a much different history than we do now. So I agree, those people are dangerous. But I think if we understand violence like we understand an illness, how do we prevent the illness? We know, okay, what causes infectious disease, right? Rats, sewage, human waste. So we kind of have ways to, we have a sewer system to kind of keep the waste out of the streets. If we realize, okay, what causes Hitler to come to power, we can kind of have preventative methods to prevent that. So, thank you. Yes?
I wanted to follow up on what David Collins was talking about. And the lessons of Vietnam, in Nixon's memoir, he said that what stopped the Vietnam War was critical thinking. That if college students hadn't stopped and thought about that there was no connection between their security and the war, that there never would have been the ideological base to build such a wide building. And he started a movement in education to wind down critical thinking and to get people to think more like trades, Bismarck schools.
Right.
So here we are with the Center for Nonviolence in this program here. I just didn't want that to get left out, because I think what they're doing here is a very unique and brave thing that is an important part, that people need to think for themselves. And like you were saying, the discipline is to stop. Part of that is to stop you for thinking for yourself.
Right.
You have to follow those orders without question. So I just thought if you could talk a little bit about critical thinking and thinking, moving us into a...
Okay, and this will be the last question. I know you all have to go. So, yeah, critical thinking is vital. Now, if you look at someone like Hitler, basic rule of waging peace, nonviolence, going back to Chicken Little, going back to what we know about the human brain, is when people become really afraid and really angry, they cannot think straight. The part of your brain that does critical thinking literally shuts off. So whenever you hear any political leader or person on the radio or news commentator try to make you angry or afraid, immediately become extremely skeptical of everything they say. The number one rule. I don't care who it is, Democrat, Republican, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, whenever you hear anyone in the media or any politician try to make you afraid or try to make you angry, immediately become extremely skeptical of what they're telling you. Because when you become angry and fearful, you know you're not going to be able to think straight. Now, if you look at Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., they never tried to get people afraid and angry. And look at the conditions they were living in. Martin Luther King Jr. is receiving dozens of death threats a day. His house is bombed. He's eventually killed. He's living under segregation. Gandhi's beaten multiple times. Gandhi is killed. Nelson Mandela's in prison for 27 years. I'd be pretty pissed off after a couple years in prison. But what they were trying to do is they were not trying to appeal to people's fear. They were not trying to appeal to people's fear or hatred or anger. They were trying to appeal to people's conscience, trying to appeal to their compassion, trying to appeal to their sense of right and wrong, trying to appeal to their sense of hope. And when you appeal to conscience and compassion, they're trying to calm people down so they can think rationally. So they're trying to appeal to people's conscience, their compassion, their reason. So Martin Luther King Jr. is trying to reason with people. He's trying to get people calm, give them hope. People crave hope like they crave food and water, and he's saying, look, just think about this rationally. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, we all have a right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Don't black people also deserve that right? So I think critical thinking is essential. If you don't have critical thinking, anybody can fool you. I mean, anybody can come along and say, give me $1,000 and I'm going to give you a rock that's going to cure all your illnesses. But we're not really taught critical thinking. Think about everything we're not taught in school. We're not really taught critical thinking or how to be human or how to have empathy. When I was in elementary school, nobody taught me how to overcome fear or how to overcome hatred or how to cooperate with people or how to have a healthy relationship, how to have a good friendship. You're just not taught these critical things in school. You're not really taught how to think critically, how to question what you're being told. And I think from a very young age, you're kind of taught not to question things. But I think you're right. Critical thinking is essential. And again, these are all magic tricks. These are illusions. These are master illusionists. You see how the illusion's done? And you go, oh, I see. That's a pretty good magic trick. You fooled me. You made me think that the Muslim people hate us because we're free, and they're all a bunch of freedom-hating terrorists. But that was a trick. And I see it through the illusion. The reality is more complex than that. So, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
I want to thank Paul on behalf of the Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies. Geshe Tuvden Tindar has a small gift for you, Paul.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
We want you to feel like you're a part of our center, and there's one of our
thank you.
Nonviolence and Peace training chairs.
Thank you very much.
And one of our training chairs.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate you coming out. You're listening to great questions. There are some books you can really dig deeper and read more as long as I did. So, and I'm sure if you want to say a few words directly to Paul,